The air was heavy that afternoon, the kind that makes a small town feel even smaller. Dust floated in the sunlight, and every face in the crowd turned toward one man, the sheriff. His boots pressed into the dry earth as he stepped forward, his voice deep and slow. "Choose any woman you want," he said. The words hung in the air like a challenge, sharp and unexpected. No one spoke. Not even the wind dared to move. The man standing across from him, tired and weathered, didn't lift his head at first. His hat shaded his eyes, hiding the story written in them. He wasn't the kind of man who liked attention. He'd always been quiet, working the land, raising his twin girls after losing everything that once gave his life meaning. But now, here he was, standing in front of the sheriff, being asked to make a choice that didn't feel like his to make. Around them, whispers began to rise. The townsfolk leaned on fences, shifting their weight, eyes darting between the sheriff and the man. Some smiled, some frowned. It wasn't every day that a lawman gave an order like that. The man's hands trembled slightly. He wasn't scared, not of the sheriff, not of the people, but of what this choice might mean. He looked down at the ground, at the small footprints beside his boots. Two little girls stood there, clutching each other's hands. Their eyes were wide, not frightened, just curious. They didn't understand why their papa looked so lost. To them, life was simple, good people were good, bad people were bad, and love was something you could see in someone's eyes. But for their father, the world hadn't felt simple in a long time. The sheriff watched him closely, waiting. The silence grew heavier. The man finally lifted his head and met the sheriff's gaze, confusion flickering behind his tired stare. How could a man choose something as fragile and real as love? How could he pick a woman, as if kindness or comfort were things to be handed out like rewards? And yet, standing there with the whole town watching, he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. He opened his mouth to speak, but before a single word left his lips, two soft voices broke the stillness. The town was small enough that news didn't travel, it simply lived in the air. Every porch, every window, every corner store carried whispers that never really disappeared. You could tell who was in love, who was in debt, and who was just trying to make it through another dry season. And in this town, everyone knew him. The quiet man with the tired eyes and the two little girls who followed him like sunlight follows the morning. He lived on the edge of town, where the land turned from dirt to field and the road thinned into dust. His house was small, the kind that groaned in the wind and sighed when the rain came. But inside, it carried laughter, faint but warm, like a candle trying to stay lit. The girls had made drawings on the walls with bits of chalk they'd found near the school. The man never erased them. He liked waking up to those little scribbles. He said they reminded him that the world still had color. The sheriff, on the other hand, belonged to the heart of the town. His office sat right beside the church and across from the old general store. He'd been the law there for more than 20 years. People respected him, sometimes feared him, but mostly trusted him. He wasn't cruel, but he was firm, the kind of man whose silence carried more weight than most men's anger. Yet that day, when he stood before the quiet man and told him to choose, there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't command, it was concern. He'd seen too many folks fade into loneliness after loss. He'd seen men who once stood tall crumble into shadows when life took what they loved most. And this man, this humble father, had been walking around like a ghost for years. The sheriff wasn't trying to mock him. He was trying to wake him up. But the way his words came out, the way they echoed, "Choose any woman you want," made it sound like a test, or worse, a judgment. The people in town loved stories. They fed on them like fire needs wood. Some of them said the sheriff wanted to teach the man about courage, to make him take a step toward life again. Others said it was all for show, a public spectacle meant to shake up a quiet day. Whatever it was, the crowd came. They gathered behind the sheriff's office, where the dirt road met the well, and the whole scene unfolded like a play they didn't want to end. The man stood there, shoulders heavy, hat pulled low. His hands were rough, cracked from work, the kind that had known both creation and struggle. His daughters, twin girls no older than 7, stayed close to his legs, peeking out from behind him. They were mirror images of each other, from their tangled brown hair to the little freckles on their cheeks. They rarely spoke in public. The man had raised them to be polite, to listen more than they talked. But anyone who looked close could see their eyes sparkle with a kind of quiet knowing, like they understood more than they were supposed to. Behind the crowd stood a woman, half hidden near the water barrels. She wore a plain dress, her hair pinned up loosely. Most folks didn't notice her, and that suited her fine. She worked at the small bakery near the church, arriving before dawn and leaving long after sunset. Sometimes, when the man came to town for supplies, she'd pack an extra loaf for his girls. "Too fresh to waste," she'd say with a soft smile. The man never said much, just tipped his hat and thanked her, but the girls always waved and grinned. That woman stood there now, quiet and still, watching the scene unfold. The sheriff cleared his throat, his voice deep and steady. "You've worked hard, raised your girls right. But a man can't carry the world alone forever," he said. "You need someone beside you, it's time." His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried authority. The crowd murmured. The man didn't answer. He looked at his daughters. They were clutching each other's hands, small fingers tangled tight. He could see the worry on their faces, and that hurt him more than anything. He remembered the day their mother died. The house had gone so quiet he could hear the clock ticking for hours. The girls had been too young to understand. They just kept asking when Mama was coming back. He tried to be both father and mother, tried to keep their laughter alive. But there were nights when the loneliness pressed on his chest like a stone. And now here was the sheriff, asking him to choose, to move on, to begin again. But how do you choose someone when you're still haunted by what you've lost? How do you look at a woman and not see the shadow of another? He stared down at the ground, feeling the eyes of the town on him. The weight of judgment, of pity, of curiosity, it all sat heavy in the pit of his stomach. He wanted to turn and walk away, to go back to the farm, to the safety of silence. But the sheriff's voice pinned him there. The girls tugged gently at his sleeve, their voices barely above a whisper. "Papa," one of them said, "why do you have to pick someone?" He didn't answer. He didn't know how. The sheriff shifted his stance, his expression softening just a little. "Not every choice is about wanting, son," he said. "Sometimes it's about needing, for them if not for you." That struck a chord. The man looked down again at the twins. They were staring up at him, eyes round and trusting. Everything he'd ever done, every long day, every sleepless night, it was all for them. Maybe the sheriff was right. Maybe this wasn't about him at all. Maybe it was about giving his girls a chance at something more, a mother's warmth, a woman's voice in their small, echoing home. He lifted his gaze slowly, scanning the faces before him. Women he'd known for years. Some kind, some distant, some just curious. His heart didn't move for any of them. Not until his eyes drifted past the crowd, toward the edge of the square, where the woman from the bakery stood, half hidden, watching with quiet sympathy. She didn't look away when their eyes met. She simply smiled, the same soft smile she'd given his daughters every time she handed them a loaf of bread. And in that quiet moment, the man felt something shift. Not love, not yet, but something small and alive, like a spark finding air. The twins noticed too. Their little faces lit up as if they'd just remembered something important. They turned to each other, whispering, their voices so light the crowd didn't hear, but the father did. He heard every word. The sheriff waited. The man opened his mouth to speak, but hesitation held him. The twins tugged again, looking up at him with innocent certainty. They didn't understand all the rules of the world. They didn't care about gossip or pride. They just knew what felt right. And as they looked toward that woman again, one of them smiled, whispering to her sister, "That's her." The other nodded, her small voice barely carrying through the hum of the crowd. "Papa's going to see her." And without realizing it, the whole town began to hold its breath. The sheriff's voice carried across the square, steady as ever, but the words struck deeper than anyone expected. "Choose any woman you want," he repeated. as though that command could fix the cracks that years of loneliness had carved into one man's heart. The crowd leaned in, curious and hungry for something to talk about later. They wanted to see what the quiet widower would do. The man didn't move. His hat shielded his face from the sun, but everyone could see the tension in his jaw. He wasn't a man used to being told what to do, especially not when it came to matters of the heart. Still, the sheriff wasn't cruel. There was no mockery in his tone, only a strange mix of firmness and care, the way a father might speak to a stubborn son. The people didn't see that. They saw only the spectacle, a man being pushed into a decision about love in front of everyone he knew. The man's thoughts weren't on the sheriff or the crowd. They were on his daughters. He could feel the small tug at his sleeve as one of them leaned close, whispering, "Papa, why is everyone looking?" He didn't answer. How could he explain that grown-ups sometimes turned pain into entertainment? How could he tell them that what looked like kindness could still sting like shame? He had been content in his solitude. The land gave him enough to keep his hands busy, and his daughters gave him enough reason to keep breathing. But late at night, when the world went still and the only sound was the wind outside the window, the quiet became too heavy to bear. That was when memories returned, the sound of his wife's laughter, the way she'd hum while hanging laundry, the smell of her bread baking. Those memories didn't comfort him anymore, they haunted him, and the sheriff had seen it. Maybe that was why he stepped in now, trying to force the man toward something new. But the sheriff's way of helping felt wrong. You can't command a heart to heal. You can't order someone to love again. The man's chest tightened. He wanted to speak, to say he wasn't ready, but words caught in his throat. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, waiting. Every woman there had her own thoughts, some curious, some embarrassed, a few hopeful. They weren't bad people, they just didn't understand the weight of what he carried. The sheriff took a slow step closer. "You've done right by your girls," he said quietly, "but they need more than your hard work. They need a home that feels whole." His gaze softened, though his words were firm. The man clenched his fists. He wasn't angry at the sheriff, but the truth in those words stung. He'd seen the way his daughters' smiles sometimes faded when they watched other children run into their mother's arms. He'd seen them brush their doll's hair and whisper, "Mama says it's bedtime," pretending someone still tucked them in. Those tiny wounds, the ones that didn't bleed, were the hardest to heal. The crowd began to murmur again, restless with silence. Some men folded their arms, smirking as though this were a test of pride. Some women whispered behind their hands, but the twins stood quietly, their eyes darting from their father to the sheriff, then to the faces around them. They didn't understand the politics of pity or pride. They just knew their father's heart hurt in ways they couldn't name. The sheriff gestured toward the gathered women, his voice carrying like a low rumble. "There's no shame in starting over," he said. "You've earned happiness. So go on, choose." The man's throat felt dry. He didn't want to look at them like they were choices on display, like this moment was some kind of market of hearts. But he also couldn't ignore the truth that maybe, just maybe, his daughters deserved a chance at something more. He forced himself to lift his eyes. He saw familiar faces. The widow from the mercantile, always polite but distant. The teacher who once brought soup when the girls were sick. The farmer's daughter with kind eyes but a nervous laugh. Each one seemed kind, but none stirred anything inside him except gratitude. Gratitude wasn't love. Gratitude didn't make your heart race or your chest ache. He lowered his gaze again, frustrated with himself for even trying. The twins tugged his sleeve again, a little stronger this time. "Papa," one whispered, "you don't have to be scared." He almost smiled. He wasn't scared of the women or the sheriff or the eyes on him. He was scared of what would happen if he chose wrong. What if he opened his heart again and it broke once more? What if another woman left him, by choice or by fate, and his daughters had to see him fall apart all over again? The sheriff shifted his stance, exhaling slowly. "This ain't punishment," he said, softer now. "It's mercy. You've been alone too long." For a brief moment their eyes met. The sheriff wasn't challenging him anymore. He was pleading. Maybe he saw a bit of himself in the man, someone who'd lost more than he let the world see. But the words still didn't sit right. They sounded too final, too heavy, as if the man's heart were something to be repaired by decree. The man's gaze drifted again, past the line of curious faces, toward the bakery at the edge of the square. And there she was, the woman who'd always seemed to notice his daughters before anyone else did. She wasn't standing close like the others. She was by the doorway, half in shadow, holding a small basket against her hip. When his eyes met hers, she didn't look away. She gave a faint smile, one that didn't ask for anything in return. Something inside him shifted, barely, like the first creak of a door that's been shut for too long. The girls followed his gaze. Their tiny fingers loosened on his sleeve. They knew her. They remembered the soft hands that tied ribbons in their hair when he wasn't looking, the gentle voice that once told them stories when they stopped by the bakery. The sheriff noticed the direction of his eyes but said nothing. The crowd didn't see it yet. Only the girls did. They shared a glance, one of those silent exchanges that only twins understand. Then one of them whispered to the other, and both began to smile, the kind of smile that made the air feel lighter. The man still hadn't spoken. His mouth opened slightly, but his voice betrayed him. The sheriff waited. The crowd leaned forward. The twins looked up, and one of them tugged his hand again. "Papa," she said softly, her voice clear enough to hush the whispers, "look." He did. And for the first time in years his chest didn't feel so heavy, but he didn't move yet. He stood frozen, caught between the past he couldn't let go of and the future that had just begun to call his name. The silence that followed felt alive. It stretched thin across the square, humming with unspoken questions. The sheriff stood firm, hands resting on his belt, eyes watching the man in front of him, waiting. The townsfolk held their breath, sensing something was about to happen but not knowing what. The twins, still clutching their father's hand, exchanged a glance only they understood. And then in voices soft but clear enough to slice through the stillness, they spoke. "Papa," one said, tugging gently at his sleeve. "That's her." Every head turned. It wasn't a shout, not even a plea. It was a statement, pure and certain, spoken with the kind of innocence that adults lose too soon. The girls were pointing, not toward the women who stood closest, not toward the ones who watched with practiced smiles, but toward the woman by the bakery, the one who had tried to remain unseen. She froze when she realized every eye had turned her way. Her hands tightened around the basket she held, as if it could shield her from the sudden attention. The sheriff's brow lifted, and the man, the quiet, weary father, followed his daughter's gaze. His breath caught. He didn't move, but his heart did. The twins' small hands slipped free from his. They took a few steps forward, fearless in the way only children can be. The crowd parted without a word. The girls walked straight toward the woman, their little boots kicking up soft clouds of dust. They stopped in front of her and looked up, identical faces glowing in the sunlight. The woman's voice trembled as she spoke. "Sweethearts, what are you doing?" One of them smiled. "We told Papa you're the one." The crowd began to murmur, confusion rippling through it like wind through tall grass. The sheriff didn't say a thing. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in curiosity. The man took a hesitant step forward. He didn't know what to do, what to say. His daughters had acted on something instinctive, something unexplainable. But deep down, a part of him knew they hadn't chosen at random. He remembered the first time he'd seen that woman, months ago. It was after a storm had torn through the town, flooding the fields and washing away half his crops. He'd gone to town to ask about supplies, desperate and frustrated. The bakery had been one of the only places still open. She had stood behind the counter, covered in flour, face tired but smiling. When he'd told her he couldn't pay until the next harvest, she just nodded and said, "Then take it now. Feed your girls. You can pay when the sun feels kind again." He'd never forgotten those words. Now, as he looked at her across the square, standing with his daughters at her feet, that memory rose like warmth in his chest. The sheriff watched him carefully. "Well," he said, voice even, "looks like the girls have spoken." The crowd chuckled nervously. Some people smiled, others frowned, whispering behind their hands. But the man wasn't listening to them anymore. His world had narrowed to three figures, the woman, and his daughters looking up at her like she was someone they'd always known. The woman crouched down, setting her basket on the ground. She brushed a bit of dust from one girl's cheek and whispered, "Now, what makes you think I'm the one your papa should choose?" One of the twins grinned, missing a front tooth. "Because you're nice," she said simply. "You talk soft, you don't look at him like everyone else does." The woman's eyes softened. "And how do they look at him?" The second twin tilted her head. "Like he's broken." The words hit like a bell. The crowd went quiet again, shame threading through the silence. The woman looked up and her gaze met the man's. For a moment neither of them looked away. The sheriff shifted his stance, clearing his throat, but even he didn't interrupt. The man finally found his voice. It was rough and low. "Girls," he said, "that's enough now." But his tone didn't have any real strength. The twins turned, eyes bright. "But Papa," one said, "we know." The woman stood slowly, brushing her skirt. She looked at the man, then at the sheriff. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she said quietly. "I didn't come here to be chosen." The sheriff gave a half-smile. "Sometimes life doesn't wait for us to be ready." The man took another step closer. His boots pressed into the earth, his pulse loud in his ears. He wanted to speak, to thank her, to explain, but the right words wouldn't come. All he could manage was a quiet, "You've been kind to us, more than I deserved." She shook her head. "Kindness doesn't need to be deserved." Her words carried softly, but everyone heard them. The twins beamed. The sheriff's gaze softened, the corners of his mouth turning up just slightly. And in that suspended moment, something in the man's chest cracked open. For years, he'd walked through life as if love were something buried too deep to find again. But now, with his daughters smiling, the sheriff watching, and this woman standing before him with quiet courage, he realized how wrong he'd been. Love didn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it came as two little voices saying, "That's her." The twins ran back to their father, excitement bubbling from them like spring water. "See, Papa. We told you." They tugged at his hands, pulling him closer to her. The crowd watched, silent now, their earlier curiosity replaced with something gentler, maybe wonder, maybe respect. The sheriff took a slow breath and tipped his hat. "Seems your daughter's got better judgment than most men I know," he said, his tone carrying a hint of humor. The man didn't laugh, but a small, uncertain smile tugged at his lips. He looked down at the twins, then back at the woman. The world around him blurred, the whispers, the dust, the watchful eyes. All he could see was her, standing steady despite the attention, her gaze calm and kind. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Sometimes words only get in the way of what hearts already understand. The twins leaned against his legs, their tiny fingers curled around his coat. The woman reached for her basket, but before she turned to leave, she met his eyes once more. And for the first time in a very long while, he didn't look away. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. The sheriff didn't push further. And the girls, sensing something new and good in the air, squeezed their father's hands tighter, their smiles wide and knowing. The wind picked up slightly, stirring dust and whispers across the square, and though no one said it out loud, everyone could feel it, the beginning of something they hadn't expected to witness. The square had gone so still that even the sound of the wind seemed to fade. The woman stood there, her hands trembling slightly as she held the empty basket against her chest. The twins clung to their father's coat, their eyes wide and bright, still smiling as if they had done something brave. And in truth, they had. They'd said out loud what no one else dared to, what their father had buried too deep to see for himself. The sheriff didn't speak. He just watched, his thumb tracing the worn edge of the badge pinned to his vest. He'd been around long enough to know that some moments didn't need a lawman, only silence. The people in the crowd began to shift, murmuring in low voices, unsure if they were witnessing a blessing or something private that wasn't meant for their eyes. The man stood frozen, every muscle tense. He'd spent years building walls around himself, walls made of guilt, fear, and habit. He told himself that his life was enough. His work, his daughters, his solitude. But now, with the twins' words still echoing through the air, those walls began to crack. He looked at the woman, really looked at her, and saw more than the baker who sold him bread. He saw the way she had always looked at his daughters, not with pity but with quiet affection. He saw the steadiness in her eyes, the way her hands never seemed to stop moving, always doing something kind for someone else. His chest felt tight. He took a breath, the first one in what felt like years that reached all the way to his lungs. The twins turned to him, waiting for him to speak, their faces full of anticipation. They didn't understand how much weight their small voices carried. To them, it was simple. Papa needed someone who made him smile again. But to him, it was everything. The sheriff's voice finally broke the silence. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "seems like your little girl's already made your choice for you." His tone was light, but there was something kind in it, almost protective. The man gave a faint, uneasy smile. "They've got a habit of doing that," he said softly, glancing down at the twins. The girls giggled, proud of themselves. The sound loosened something inside him. A laugh that had been trapped for years found its way out, quiet and uncertain but real. The woman looked at him, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. She didn't step forward. Instead, she waited, her eyes searching his face. The crowd had begun to thin. Some people drifted away, disappointed there wasn't a spectacle. Others stayed, pretending to browse the nearby stalls but really watching, unable to pull themselves away from the fragile moment unfolding. The man took a hesitant step forward, then another. His boots scraped against the dirt, slow, deliberate. The twins followed close, their tiny hands holding onto his coat. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because he didn't want to move forward, but because he was afraid of what it meant to finally let go of the past. When he stopped in front of her, only a few feet separated them. She kept her eyes on him, her fingers tightening around the basket she still held like a shield. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered. "The girls they don't understand how the world works yet." He shook his head slowly. "Maybe they understand better than the rest of us." She blinked, startled by the honesty in his tone. He wasn't smiling now. His eyes, though still shadowed with grief, held something she hadn't seen before, a flicker of warmth, fragile but real. The sheriff shifted behind them, his voice gentler now. "Sometimes it takes a child's truth to wake up a grown man," he said. "Ain't nothing shameful in that." The woman looked down at the twins, who stood close together, their faces glowing with pride. "You two are quite something," she said softly. One of them grinned, tugging on her skirt. "Papa says you make the best bread," she said. The woman laughed, a quiet, nervous laugh that melted the last bit of tension in the air. "Is that so?" The man nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "They don't lie much." The sheriff turned away, pretending to check his watch, but there was a faint smile tugging at his lips. The moment didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the man, his daughters, and the woman who hadn't meant to be part of any of this. The twins started talking again, their voices overlapping as they told the woman about the drawings they'd made on their kitchen wall, about the rabbits that lived behind the barn, about how their papa burned the bread every time he tried to make it himself. Their chatter was light and full of life, and the woman listened with patience, kneeling so she could meet their eyes. The man watched, unable to look away. There was something deeply familiar in that simple scene, the sound of laughter, the soft rhythm of a woman's voice filling the empty spaces in his life. It wasn't the same as before, it wasn't meant to be, but it felt right. The sheriff finally turned back to them, his boots crunching against the dirt. "Looks like my work here's done," he said, tipping his hat. "You folks carry on." He walked away, leaving behind a square still heavy with dust but lighter somehow, as if the air itself had changed. The crowd began to scatter completely, their whispers fading into the hum of everyday life. Soon it was just the four of them, the man, the woman, and the two little girls standing between them. For a long time none of them spoke. The man's hands twitched at his sides, unsure of what to do. He wanted to thank her, to tell her he hadn't expected this, but words felt too small for what was happening. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small cloth, and handed it to her. "You dropped this once," he said. She took it, recognizing the faint pattern of flour stains. "I thought I lost it," she said softly. He nodded. "Guess it found its way back." The twins smiled up at her, their eyes bright as the afternoon sun. "See, Papa," one said, her voice brimming with excitement. "She's supposed to be with us." He knelt down beside them, placing a hand on each of their small shoulders. "You think so?" They nodded in perfect unison. "We know so." The woman looked down at them, then at him, and for the first time since the sheriff had spoken, she smiled without fear. The kind of smile that said she understood something bigger than words. A promise, perhaps, or a beginning neither of them had planned for. And as the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the street in gold and shadow, the man realized that the choice he'd been forced to make wasn't really a choice at all. It was something that had been quietly waiting for him, carried by two little voices who had seen love long before he had. The sun had nearly slipped behind the ridge, painting the edges of the sky in warm gold and soft gray. The square that had once buzzed with whispers was quiet now, save for the rustle of leaves and the far-off creak of a barn door. The man stood there, still, his daughters at his side, watching the last bit of daylight fade. The woman hadn't left yet. She lingered by the bakery steps, her basket now empty, her eyes following the twins as they giggled softly to each other, unaware of how much their little voices had changed the day. The sheriff was gone. The crowd, too. What remained was only the echo of words that had seemed so simple, yet had cut straight through everything the man thought he understood. "Choose any woman you want." The phrase had started as an order, a command wrapped in pity and good intention. But it had ended differently, broken apart and reshaped by two small children who had turned it into something pure. The man couldn't shake the sound of it, their voices, so soft and certain, saying, "That's her." He looked down at his daughters, their hands now sticky with bits of bread the woman had given them before. They were humming a tune, some song their mother used to sing, one they barely remembered but carried anyway. It was strange, how life worked, how the same moments that once felt heavy could suddenly turn light when seen through a child's eyes. He envied that. He wished he could see the world that way again. The woman began to walk toward them, slow steps that seemed careful, unsure. Her apron fluttered in the faint breeze, her hair catching bits of sunlight. When she stopped in front of them, she smiled, not wide, not nervous, just honest. "You should take them home," she said gently. "It's getting late." He nodded, but he didn't move. His hands flexed at his sides as though they were searching for words before his mind could find them. "They like your bread," he said quietly, almost to himself. She chuckled, a small, musical sound. "Then they're smart girls." "They take after their mother," he said. The words slipped out before he could stop them. He almost apologized, but she didn't flinch. She just looked at him with understanding, the kind that didn't need explanation. The twins were chasing a moth now, laughing as it danced just out of reach. The sound filled the square, bouncing off the brick walls and fading into the fields. It was the sound of something simple and whole. The man watched them, then turned back to the woman. "I didn't mean for them to say that," he said. They don't always know when to stay quiet." "I know," she said softly. "That's what makes them wonderful." He smiled faintly. "They think the world is easy." She looked at him then, really looked, the way someone looks when they're trying to see what another person is hiding. "Maybe they're right," she said after a pause. "Maybe the world only gets hard because we make it that way." He didn't answer. He didn't know how, but her words stayed with him. He'd spent years thinking that love was a chapter that had closed, that what he'd lost had taken with it the right to ever feel anything new. But now, standing there in the quiet with her, he realized that maybe love didn't vanish. It just changed shape, waiting for someone brave enough to see it again. The twins came running back, out of breath, cheeks flushed pink. One of them held a small white flower, its stem nearly broken. "For you," she said, holding it out to the woman. "Because you make Papa smile." The woman froze, then knelt down and took the flower with both hands, as though it were the most delicate thing she'd ever been given. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's the nicest thing anyone said all day." The man's throat tightened. He hadn't realized he was smiling, but he was. A real one, not the polite one he used when people asked how he was doing. This one came from somewhere deeper, from a place that hadn't been touched in a long time. The woman rose, brushing dust from her skirt. "I should go," she said. "The bread won't bake itself." He wanted to stop her, to say something that would make her stay, but all he managed was, "We'll come by tomorrow. The girls like the rolls with the honey glaze." She grinned. "Then I'll make extra," he nodded. It was such a simple exchange, ordinary even, but it carried something more. The kind of small promise that could quietly become the start of everything. As she turned and walked away, the twins waved until she disappeared behind the bakery door. The man watched the light fade from the windows, a slow calm settling over him. The sheriff's challenge, the crowd's whispers, the weight of the past, they all seemed to drift away, replaced by something softer. The twins tugged at his hand. "Papa," one of them said, "do you think she'll come to supper someday?" He looked down at them, at their hopeful faces, and for once, he didn't answer with caution or doubt. He simply said, "Maybe." They accepted that answer easily, the way children do. To them, maybe wasn't uncertain, it was a door left open. And as they walked home beneath the deepening sky, the man felt that door opening wider with every step. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of flour and fresh bread from the bakery down the road. He breathed it in, feeling something unfamiliar in his chest, peace maybe, or hope. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. The girls skipped ahead, chasing fireflies now, their laughter echoing through the twilight. He let them run, their little figures glowing like tiny lanterns against the dark. For years he'd been walking through life half asleep, afraid to dream again. But tonight, as the first stars blinked awake, he realized he was finally waking up. And though he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, he knew this much. Sometimes the truest choices aren't made in words, or under the weight of commands. They're made in small moments, carried on laughter, sealed by faith, and spoken first by the ones who see the world with eyes unclouded by fear. He looked once more toward the bakery's faint light, then followed his daughters down the road, the dust rising soft beneath their feet as the night wrapped around them like a promise still unfolding.